Going to go ahead and get started. This is Solving Teacher Inequity, not Inequities, as Mark read it, Solving Teacher Inequities by Putting Knowledge into Action. And the goal of this session is to help us raise insights about how research knowledge can be put into action. I'm Linda Darling-Hammond, president at the Learning Policy Institute. We have a powerhouse group of discussants and presenters. There's going to be a lot of time for you also to contribute to the conversation. So if you have questions, save them up, write them down. We'll have an opportunity to get those into the mix. This session will both look at the issues around the inequitable distribution of teachers. A lot of research that has been done in recent years about that inequitable distribution of teachers, about the issues of equity in recruiting and retaining teachers, in teacher shortages, supply and demand, and then also hear from folks who have been involved in using this kind of research and their own knowledge and expertise with governors, with state legislators, in litigation with other policy leaders, and have a real discussion about the ways in which research can inform action, the ways in which it can be improved to support more productive action in the world, and at the end of the day, actually solve some of the problems that it identifies. We're going to start off with just a few minutes of a presentation in the first 15 minutes or so about the status of the field in teacher supply, demand, shortage, and inequitable distribution. We're going to hear first from Lieb Sucher and Desiree Carver-Thomas, who are research associates at the Learning Policy Institute. Both of them are involved in significant work on teacher supply, demand, labor market issues, and have published a number of reports in the last 2 years on that topic. And will be followed by Richard Ingersoll, who is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania in education and sociology. He is concerned with the character of elementary and secondary schools as workplaces, teachers as employees, and teaching as a job. He's very well known for his work on teacher supply, demand, retention, and attrition, and has received numerous awards for that work. He is a former high school teacher and knows of what he speaks from experience as well as from analysis. After we've gotten sort of warmed up with the state of the field, we'll get into a conversation with our other presenters. David Hinojosa on my far left. That is not a political statement, but maybe it is. He is a He is a national leading advocate and litigator in the area of civil rights with a focus on educational impact issues. I first met David when he was a litigator with the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDEF, and he was working on these issues of teacher inequities and school finance inequities in many cases around the country, but especially in Texas. He is now the Intercultural Development Research Association's director of, what is EAC? The
Equity Assistance Center.
Thank you, the Equity Assistance Center South. And he is their policy leader on these issues of equity. So we'll hear sort of that frame of reference for the use of the knowledge, and then we will hear from Mark Tucker, who is to my close left. Again, not necessarily a political statement, but he is the president of the National Center for Education on the Economy, and under the aegis of NCEE, he leads the Center for International Education Benchmarking. Mark has a long and distinguished career in education. He was the person who first thought up the idea and launched the organization of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. He led a number of commissions that have done reports about the status of American education. He's been looking at international exemplars as one of the ways to understand how to move American education forward. And we'll hear from him from all of those perspectives. Michelle Ekstrom, again, not a political statement, over here to my right, is Education Program Director at the National Conference for State Legislators. She's been there for 18 years, following a stint as a legislative staffer in Colorado. So she's done this work on the ground and with lots and lots of states over many years. And they've taken up these issues of teacher supply and demand and teacher equities and inequities in multiple cycles of reform over many eras. And then we'll hear from Arrocha-Samuel, who is the relatively new Division Director for Education at the National Governors Association. And she will bring to us sort of the perspective of state leaders. She was involved in state policy herself in Arizona, and before that was a principal and a teacher in Arizona and Florida. So she too brings the perspective of life on the ground in classrooms and at the State House, from the schoolhouse to the State House. And I think those perspectives are really important as we try to think about what we're going to do to both understand the problems we face and then address them. So with no further ado, I'm going to get started here with Lieb and Desiree.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. It's so great to see such a large turnout for this important topic. So, as you may know, there's been lots of, in the past several school years, there's been lots of press on teacher shortages from across the country. However, surprisingly, maybe, there's little academic research on the nature or extent of these shortages. So LPI set out to aid the policy community in understanding the severity and prevalence of teacher shortages. But from the beginning, we knew a long research report wasn't going to be read by policymakers. So in this presentation, we'll share also what we learned about sharing our research with different audiences. So our paper summarized a theoretical framework, investigated how the issue varied, looked into what was driving shortages, and provided evidence-based policy responses. We released this report at an event in DC that brought together researchers and policymakers through presentations, panels, and breakout groups that featured students, parents, teachers, principals, policymakers, advocates, and researchers. We unpacked the issue of shortages. I'm going to quickly go over our high-level findings just as background, and then Desiree is going to talk more about how we've communicated this research to turn knowledge into action. So this graph shows our current projection of national demand in black and estimated supply in blue. As you can see, the black line, demand, steeply starts rising in 2013 as districts began to reinstate some of the classes and programs that were reduced or eliminated during the recession. This hiring increase comes at a time where we see declining supply. And in brief, these opposing trends have left our classrooms short, around 60,000 teachers this past year. And if current trends continue, the shortage will only worsen. But it's important to remember teacher shortages look very different across subject areas and locations as a function of the various policies and conditions at play. So for example, each state will feel the impact of the overall shortage differently. To illustrate this point, we're going to compare Arizona and Oregon. So in Arizona, teachers only earn 62% of what non-teachers earn, controlling for education, age, and hours worked, the lowest in the nation. Arizona teachers on average feel less supported by their administration, report less cooperation and less classroom autonomy than most states, and their attrition rate is one of the highest in the country. Oregon, on the other hand, has above average wage competitiveness in relation to other states, have some of the best reported working conditions, and their attrition rate is half that of Arizona's. So the factors influencing shortages vary substantially state to state, as do the shortages themselves. However, almost every state is experiencing shortages in certain subjects. Shortages are particularly severe in special education, followed by math and science, and depending on state demographics, more than 30 states reported shortages in bilingual or English learner education. And so part of why we're here today is to talk about the inequitable distribution. When there aren't enough teachers to go around, it's the schools with the fewest resources and least desirable working conditions that are left with the vacancies. So we could already be seeing the impacts of this in the new Office of Civil Rights data collection data. In 2014, on average, less than 1% of teachers were uncertified in low minority schools, while 4 times as many were uncertified in high minority schools. Not only are teachers without full preparation generally worse for student outcomes, but they also only act as a Band-Aid solution. Research indicates that these teachers leave at more than 2 times the rate of a fully prepared teacher, creating the leaky bucket phenomena, which is the largest driver of shortages. And Professor Ingersoll is going to talk more about attrition with you in a second. It's important to note that this cycle intensifies in high minority, high poverty schools, where there's a higher percentage of teachers with no preparation and a higher attrition rates. After reviewing what matters in the research, we can organize our policy recommendations to address this vicious cycle of underprepared teachers, leading to higher attrition, leading to more underprepared teachers, a cycle especially severe in schools serving our most disadvantaged students. So first, it's crucial to focus on building lasting supply. It takes more than just bringing new people into the profession, but ensuring they're prepared to be successful and prepared to stay. Some ways we can do this is by offering forgivable loans or service scholarships that can attract new candidates into the field and put them in areas where they need. Other ways are other high retention pathways, such as grow your own programs or teacher residencies. Second, increasing retention and keeping the teachers we have will go a long way in building a stable workforce and to put an end to the revolving door of teachers. To improve retention, policymakers can establish high-quality mentoring and induction programs, support collegial work environments and positive working conditions, and to prepare principals to support teachers. Third, increasing compensation packages and equalizing salaries among high poverty and low poverty schools can not only attract and retain more teachers, but create a more equitable distribution of qualified teachers. Districts can continue in this effort by also thinking about housing incentives or childcare as other ways to boost the total compensation package. So now that you've heard a quick background on the research, I'm going to pass you to Desiree, who's going to talk about how we communicated this to turn knowledge into action. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieb. It's important that our research reaches audiences that we think can influence policy. So that includes the public, like parents, students, and teachers who are directly impacted by shortages, federal, state, and local policymakers, and professional and advocacy organizations. For each of these audiences, we consider different tools for sharing our research and policy recommendations. I'm going to highlight some of the products we've created to do that. Typically, as researchers, we might focus on the research report, but we've found that shaping our work into different formats and partnering with several national, state, and local organizations has allowed us to effectively reach policy audiences. So when we released our report, we released it alongside an interactive map. We were able to distill some of our key points about what drives teachers out of the classroom, how it impacts our most vulnerable students, and how those conditions vary across the country into an accessible tool that could speak to a non-research audience. This appeals to journalists, the public, and state policymakers who can focus in on their own state and learn the high-level issues. The map also enables users to download and print a snapshot of conditions in their own state, including compensation measures, turnover rates, measures of working conditions, and the distribution of uncertified and inexperienced teachers by student race. This is a tool users could bring along with them to a meeting with a state legislator, for example. In addition to the big picture data that we released in the report and in the interactive, it has been important for us to focus on grounding the research in the student level impact. Lieb and I have both presented our findings in webinars with community organizations and to legislative staff. And while we share the findings that Lieb shared earlier, we also make sure to describe what this means for students. We sometimes hear that teacher supply and demand are cyclical and will self-correct eventually. But what does that mean for the student who goes through a year with a year of chemistry with substitutes all year? or for the student with special needs who is being taught by an uncertified teacher or a teacher on an emergency style credential. The impacts of the shortage can be devastating for students who may fall further and further behind while we wait for the teacher workforce to self-correct. So grounding the research in the student level impact helps to speak to our audience in ways that numbers sometimes don't. In our report, we acknowledge that while there's a national shortage, there's also wide variability in how that looks from one state or one district to the next. Providing a deep dive into state and local data is helpful in a few ways. It engages stakeholders in those locations by showing how their communities are affected by the shortage. And it allows us to home in on the particular circumstances driving shortages in those locations and tailor our recommendations accordingly. We have a series of reports on teacher shortages in California and an interactive map that shows how several factors influencing shortages vary across the state. Focusing specifically on California allowed us to tailor our recommendations to the conditions there and to have a greater impact on policy. Along with our California report, we issued a series of briefs and fact sheets on shortages in special education and how we expect bilingual education to be impacted. These two-page documents pull together just the information related to those subjects that we can share with parent and teacher groups and legislators invested in those subject areas. Short documents like these allow us to highlight the disproportionate impact of shortages on vulnerable student populations to a policy-oriented audience. Finally, the LPI team has also created briefs and fact sheets tailored to the specific roles that principals, districts, and states play. The principal brief highlights our research on the relationship between principal support and teacher retention. The state and district fact sheets offer specific actions policymakers can take to fund and implement our recommendations, and these clearly speak to advocates, lawmakers, and district administrators who can begin working to act on our recommendations. What we've seen is that policymakers have been eager for data on teacher shortages, especially when it's relatable and actionable. We've seen several states conduct their own teacher workforce research, like Washington and Oklahoma, amongst others, and make policy change to address their teacher shortages. In California, the state legislature invested $35 million in addressing teacher shortages last year, and there are several bills being considered this year in that state that cite our work. These methods certainly aren't the only ones that can effectively turn research into action, and we're eager to continue learning and trying creative methods for doing that. And we'll be happy to answer any questions you have during the next section of our panel.
Good afternoon. Well, I do research on teacher supply, demand, and quality issues and teacher shortages, and I've been doing that the last couple decades. And I'm going to follow up Lieb's and Desiree's report and just focus on a single point, one point, which is the importance of retention, teacher retention, in this larger problem of teacher shortages and the inability of so many schools to staff all their classrooms with qualified teachers. That's the long-standing issue. That's been going on for decades. And the conventional wisdom generally has been, sort of goes like this, whether it was decades ago or whether it's a news report we read last week. Sort of goes like this. We have two big demographic trends, increase in student enrollments, increase in teacher retirements. And they're colliding, and we're simply not producing enough teachers to staff all our classrooms, particularly in those hard-to-staff, disadvantaged schools. And so the solutions are straightforward. Let's bring more in. So President Obama has his 100K and 10,000 math science teachers every year for a decade, 100,000 new math science teachers. Terrific. This is wonderful. My finding is that a lack of production of new teachers is not the only or even the main source of these problems, the problem being seeing all those classrooms are staffed. That the problem isn't solely that we're not making enough teachers. The problem is also that we're losing too many. This is the turnover, the attrition, the departures, whatever we want to call it. problem. And so hence the solution can't just be recruitment, bringing in more people. That's great. But we also have to improve retention. So this, wait a second here. Here's a slide that I'm trying to capture the revolving door aspect of the teaching occupation. This is national data, and this is the 2011-2012 school year. And so that yellow arrow on the left, there's there's sort of a third of a million teachers. Those are people coming into schools that year. That's the inflow of people who weren't in those buildings the year before. Notice 10, 12 months later, a larger number, over 500,000, over 500,000, leave those schools. So in this 10, 12-month period, we have just under 1 million, almost a quarter of the nation's largest occupation. Elementary, secondary teaching is the largest occupation by far. Almost a quarter of this gigantic occupation in job transition, moving into, between, or out of schools. That's a lot. That's a great deal of flow, of movement. It's not all bad by any means. I mean, we probably don't have enough good attrition. That is, people that maybe shouldn't be teachers and we'd like them to move on. All right? But these are very high levels. Revolving door is the term we use. However, as you might imagine, the rate at which the revolving door revolves varies. There's huge school-to-school differences, which are masked by these overall data. So, on average in the nation, urban poor schools lose well over 1/5 of their teachers each and every year, something like closer to 1/4. Whereas on the other hand, affluent suburban schools lose something like 10% every year. Huge school-to-school differences, driving those shortages. Because, as the point that was made earlier by Desiree, a major reason for the hiring difficulties and the demand for new teachers, and the subsequent hire difficulties, is that people have just left several months before. So we also have big differences in teacher turnover according to race, ethnicity. This is a whole factor behind the minority teacher shortage. These bars here show us that over the last 20 years, the annual rates of turnover, departures from schools of minority teachers, that's the blue bar, significantly higher than the yellow bar, non-minority teachers. This is a big factor here. So there's big differences between schools, there's big differences amongst types of teachers. This is a big factor behind these staffing problems that needs to be addressed. That's why it's so refreshing, this report coming from LPI that's starting to look at sort of the multiple factors behind this. So why might these minority teachers leave their schools? Here's the kinds of reasons they give. Retirement at the top, that's a small piece. School staffing actions, that's layoffs or school reorganizations, involuntary transfers. Family and personal, that's, I moved out of that building because I wanted to raise babies, care for elderly folks, I had health concerns. That's sort of part of life. The bottom two bars interest me. I moved out of that school because I wanted a different or better job. And then notice the longest bar of all, I moved out of that school, I left that school, I departed because of dissatisfaction. So the image that always comes to mind is the leaky bucket. There's nothing wrong with President Obama's initiative to bring in new bright math science majors from colleges into teaching. That's great. But if we lose large numbers within a few years, we not only have wasted the investment, we haven't solved the problem. So we need to do both. Bring in people and also do a better job at retention. That's the solution here. Thank you.
In a nutshell. So one of the things that I think we've been trying to do at the Learning Policy Institute, which was founded just 2 years ago, to bring research and evidence into the policy arena directly by working with policymakers, not just throwing the research up over the fence and hoping that it lands on a policymaker's head and makes an impression of some sort, is to really try to understand the nature of the problems we face in education in ways that we could get solutions that get to root causes. Because as Michelle and Aaliyah will confirm and probably elaborate on in a few minutes, Quite often the legislative impulse is not necessarily to get to root causes or even know how to get to root causes, but just to try to find some way to address the surface problem. And Richard's just given us a good example of how the way in which we typically think about this problem doesn't actually solve it in the long run. Because if the solution is basically get some teachers in there any way possible, and if that means, as it typically does during shortage eras, like the one that I came into teaching during, that you bring a lot of people in with relatively little training, relatively little support, you kind of throw them into sink or swim, a bunch of them leave, you create more churn, you're not solving the root causes of the problem. And in fact, attrition in the United States for teachers is about 8% a year. Interestingly, that's more than twice as high as the attrition in some other high-achieving countries. And if we could cut it in half, we would basically have solved the teacher supply problem right now, because we would have a supply higher than the demand. It accounts for 90% of annual demand. And it furthermore is associated with better prepared teachers staying 2.5 times longer in the early years, better mentored teachers. Another thing that Richard Ingersoll has contributed to the literature is an understanding of how that contributes to retention of teachers and support. So we're interested in how the moment in which people pay attention to the teacher workforce, once again, because we have these recurring shortages, can allow us to begin to get at some of the root dimensions of the problem and get legislative solutions that are more productive of long-term equality and equity and quality in the teacher workforce. So I'm going to start this conversation about kind of how we get there with David Hinojosa. David has been litigating and working on these issues of school inequities for a long time. We know that in the country we have one of the most inequitably funded systems in the world. Our highest spending states spend 3 times more than our lowest spending states within each state. Highest spending districts typically spend 3 times as much as low spending districts. Within big districts, there are inequalities in the way that dollars and teachers are allocated to schools and so on. So you've been working on these issues for a long time. And I wonder if you could say something about both in that work that you did at MALDEF and in your current role as policy director at IDRA. How has research informed your action on issues in these different roles, and what do you see as key needs in research and action for solving the current situation?
Sure, and thank you very much, and welcome everybody to our wonderful, cool San Antonio, Texas here. So in the area of litigation, oftentimes the claims that we have in these cases are that the system is inequitably funded, so you compare districts, it might be based on property wealth, it might be based on student demographics and the percentage of high-needs students, for example. And then there's the adequacy claim that, there's not enough money in the system to provide school districts the resources they need to offer students the necessary opportunities they need to either, succeed, in greater life, and graduate, or, to meet the standards that the state itself has in place. And so the area of research that comes into play here is, one of the allegations is that a lot of property poor districts or high need districts don't have the resources to recruit and retain. And you saw some of the research that was presented there. And so oftentimes in the defendant states in these cases will call folks like Eric Hanashek to present their soft science on, hey, fire the bottom 5%, and that'll get things done. Or, increase class sizes, because we know doing those two things would really incentivize graduate students to go into the teaching profession, right? Because what do they want to do? They want to go in somewhere where they have the possibility of being fired, or increase their class size. So oftentimes we would call on people like Linda, especially, and she's incredibly fantastic on presenting the research. We also call on economists sometimes so they can tell, the long-term story about what's going on here. So in the Texas school finance case, we had someone who, an economist, forgetting his name right now, but he basically showed the picture of how teacher pay and nursing pay has diverged, over the years. And of course, the nursing profession, has had a lot more people more eager to go into that profession than they have in teachers. And then you throw in, accountability requirements and all these, structures and pieces of the system that really work against the profession of teaching, and you find where you're at. Putting on, the policy hat, oftentimes, at IDRA, we also have researchers on staff. I'm the only JD there at IDRA, which is based here in San Antonio. We've been around for 40 plus years. And what we like to do is
And
call
there's
ourselves,
your slide.
we like to call ourselves border crossers. There's not supposed to be a question mark up there, by the way. That was my own typo. It's normally for policymakers, and it's like, is there
It's an
really
interesting
only
question.
one? Is there only one solution, right? But this is our empirically based framework that we use to help educate people so they can see where all the different change levers are, where the school system indicators, and there you will see teaching quality is. And it's incredibly important because, as I said, with our policy work, and we also help districts, directly in the field, helping them build more equitable asset-based approaches. Sometimes with our federal grant applications, we'll use the research in the field that will support these federal grant applications. So we have, right now we have a federal grant application on transitions to teacher training, where we pair with university-based alternative education systems. And so they are busy, teaching the pedagogy and that sort, but we're helping them frame a real asset-based approach to teaching so that they don't just teach the students, but they #reach and teach the students, because that's incredibly important, especially as, the demographics continue to change. There's a lot of assets there, but instead, what people want to talk about is, it's those disadvantaged communities. Those communities actually have a lot of advantages. They have a lot of potential, a lot of opportunities. And so, how does the research discussion on that issue fit within that framework? And so it's again, incredibly important, with our grant writing. And then finally, the policy area as well. And, I'll probably get into this a little bit more later. But just this past week, for example, there's a bilingual teacher shortage in Texas. Actually, there really is. So one of the legislators proposed, and he's a West Texas legislator. I won't name him, although he is considered the rey of West Texas. But he's like, well, my districts can't, recruit and retain, bilingual teachers. Who wants to come out here to West Texas? And so what he said was, well, for bilingual education, we're going to allow them not to have a bilingual education certificate. So you're going to have someone who's not certified to teach bilingual, and that's the kind of solution. And so we throw research, and some of the research that Linda had done back in 2014, I think you had posted in a policy brief, and then some of our own research that we've done, and said, look, you know what, if you really want to fix the system, here's a bunch of different strategies, from teacher mentoring to professional development, et cetera, that would help really build that pipeline. We would help build the capacity to help these students engage with certified bilingual teachers. And but instead, that's the solution. So that's where research comes into play, because then some of the policymakers are like, well, wait a second, why are we considering that? Is that really a solution? Because then the school board, Texas Association of School Board, goes up and testifies. We didn't know it was their bill, but apparently it was their bill. And they're up there saying, well, and then once we get these teachers in these classrooms, then we can try to put them into a bilingual certification program so that in 2 or 3 years, maybe they can get there. And we're like shaking our heads, and we're like, well, why aren't you doing that right now? If you say you can do that, why aren't you doing that right now as part of your plan? So in any event, I'll leave it there and look forward to discussing this more.
All right. I'm going to ask Mark to shift gears for us to kind of the perspective of understanding how these issues play out in other countries as another way to bring knowledge to bear. An interesting thing is that we experience these tremendous inequalities. Those of you who pay attention to PISA and OECD studies know that they've been looking not only at how different countries perform on PISA, but the inequities in performance among students and the policies associated with the much lower levels of inequality that many countries attain, and the much lower levels of teacher shortage. So, Mark, you've been very involved in kind of helping us think about these things. Tell us what you think will help us here.
Well, I'm going to thank you, Linda. Thank you for inviting me to this session. I'm going to start off making some very simple, but I hope important economic points. From a certain vantage point, there is no teacher shortage. Actually, there cannot be a teacher shortage because you will get a shortage in a labor market when you're not paying enough to attract the people that you need. It's simple economics. We can solve a teacher shortage problem anytime we want to in the United States simply by lowering the standards for the people that we will accept in front of our kids. This is not a joke, it's actually what we have done for a very long time. Whenever we have a shortage, we waive the standards. We will waive them down to the point where there are none left. There will be people facing the kids, and then the cycle changes and we go back and hire people to higher standards until we get a shortage of money again. That's how it works in the United States. Let me give you an analogy from another quarter, another part of the work that I do. People ask me when we're working with the states, what will it take to make our state competitive in global commerce? And I just look at them and I say, look, there are basically two ways you can do this. Since globalization began 30 or 40 years ago, labor markets have been integrating across the world. So people in the United States increasingly are competing with people at the same skill level in countries all over the world, not just the folks next door, right? If you want to be competitive, there are two ways to do it. You can lower your wages in your state until they are competitive with the wages of people in other countries who have the same low skill levels that you have, and you will be absolutely competitive. It is not a problem to be competitive. Your people will be poor, right? There is another way to be competitive, which is to raise the skills of your people so that they can compete not with low-skilled people around the world, but with high-skilled people around the world, right? That's the basic equation the United States is now facing. So I will come back to you and observe that the problem of teacher shortages is not what it appears to be. We can actually have a first-class teacher in every schoolroom, in every state, in the United States, and not spend more money than the country is now spending on public education. And you are looking at me as if I've come from Mars. I must be out of my mind. What would make me say such a thing? And what would make me say such a thing is that I can point to at least a dozen countries in the world where you will see exactly what I just described. Countries where the per pupil cost of education is substantially below what it is in the United States, and they have literally a surplus of first-rate teachers. A surplus of first-rate teachers. And so the question, forgive me, but I come back to this. I don't think this is a matter of helping legislatures think a little bit differently about how you solve the teacher shortage problem. What you have to do is go and look at the existence proof, these dozen or so countries, where the kids are coming out of high school 2 to 3 years ahead of our kids, facing first-class teachers having made much more progress on their equity problems, as Linda just said, than we have been able to do. So the question, I presume you're still with me, the question is how they did it. That is the question. And it was that question that led us to ask Linda and a team of her colleagues to spend 2 years and a good deal of money doing an international comparative study of teacher quality in a set of countries that are very, very different from each other. That's a strong point, by the way, because in countries as different as those that she and her colleagues studied, what they found was a set of strategies being used in those countries that are actually rather like each other, but not like those that we pursue here, typically in the United States. The bottom line, if you want to solve the teacher shortage problem, and you don't want to do it by lowering standards so that all of us get poor, you have only one option. It isn't any of the widgets that have been put on the table in this meeting thus far. You have to redesign your system. You have to redesign the way the whole thing works. I am not, believe me, about to summarize this enormous piece of work that Linda and her colleagues have produced. I urge you all to read it. It is called Empowered Educators. It has just been produced. The core volume that Linda authored has just been produced by Jossie Bass-Wiley, and you'll find a lot of information about it on our website at the National Center on Education and the Economy. Let me just say a few things just to highlight, give you some idea of what I mean when I say you have to redesign your system. What these countries have done is made very explicit decisions to recruit their teachers from the upper reaches of the high school graduates in their country. The top half, the top quarter, the case of South Korea, the top 5%. They've often limited the right to offer teacher education to selective universities in these countries. In many of these countries, believe it or not, even after they have made it much harder to go into teacher education, the ratio of applications to acceptances in those institutions is very high. I'll give you one example in a minute. It's a totally different approach than we have here in the United States. They demand much more of the teacher education institutions than we typically do. Their licensure standards, I need another beer. Standards are much higher than ours are. They give their students, when in their teacher education institutions, much more and better experience teaching in schools with a great deal of support from master teachers than we typically do. Once they're in schools, I've left out some of the most interesting part. It is not possible to greatly raise standards in the way that I'm talking about, in all these ways, without making teaching much more attractive. That ought to be a fairly straightforward observation. The rates of attrition that Richard pointed to, you just don't see in these other countries. You don't see them because these occupations have been made much, much more attractive than they are in the United States. That's partly done with compensation. But even in Finland, which is famous for having first-rate teachers, the compensation is not dramatically different from the average for people who have that level of education. What makes it especially attractive in these countries is the conditions under which teachers work. We call our teachers professionals, but in fact, as a sociologist looks at teaching, what you really see is a blue-collar occupation. The job at the end is the same as the job on the first day of work. That's not what you see in these countries. What's evolving is a very different way to organize the school, organize the work, organize the career, organize the occupation. What they have been doing is creating a form of organization in the school that makes it much more like what it is like to work in a professional services firm, say, in the United States, whether we're talking about a firm of engineers, architects, accountants, you name it. They're transforming the occupation. It is becoming a true high-status profession in these countries because they have been able to do all that. You want me to stop? Because they've been able to do all that, and I will. Because they've been able to do all that, they have been able to greatly reduce what they spend on administration, management, infrastructure, all kinds of other things that we spend a whole lot of money on, which is not teachers. Anyway, we're working with a group of states to help them implement a system of the kind I'm talking about. That comes out of work that we have been doing with the National Conference of State Legislatures. And it's been a partnership that we have really enjoyed. Michelle is about to tell you a little bit about what has come of all that. Thank you.
So Michelle, tell us what has come of all that. And I want to warn you that I'm going to come back around and ask about examples that each of you may think about where a particular kind of research was particularly helpful in moving the right kinds of actions forward. Go ahead, Michelle.
So we often, is this on? Sort of. I'll just
Keep
move
it
closer.
close,
Is that
and
better?
your slides are up there.
Okay. So we often get asked, what in the world moves state legislators? It's a cynical world that we live in right now, and policymakers are not popular. But there are some really important answers here, and there's some really important stories that I want to share with you that has a lot to do with research. The average legislator has 4 years or less of experience. We are living in rapid turnover within the state legislature. The majority has swung in the majority of states. You used to see more of a balance between blue states and red states. Now, if you look at a map, it's just a sea of red. And with that comes a lot of not only inexperienced legislators, but inexperienced legislative leaders. Many state legislators sit on committees that to handle issues that they quite frankly don't know a lot about. So we at NCSL, we're a bipartisan organization that does not lobby and state legislators. We are the organization actually of all 50 state legislatures. So we work very hard to get the hard work that you all do researching what works into the hands of state legislators so they have good information to make decisions. We partner a lot with groups like LPI and like Mark and others to make sure that the information that they have is unbiased and it's research-based. We also live in the society right now of misinformation and untrue facts. In fact, with regard to this topic, one of my colleagues just forwarded to me an email from a state legislator that said, hey, I just got this message from an advocacy group in my state that says that the teacher shortage is actually all made up by left-wing conspiracy theorists. They just are trying to push the whole agenda that the unions should be in charge and teachers need more pay. It just made me laugh because that went to the entire legislature in this particular state, and this entire legislature right now is really wrangling with what to do about teacher shortages. So now you know the question has been put in their mind of, is this shortage even real? Am I buying into something that isn't even true? So we've got a real problem out there, and we've got a real challenge. One message that I would bring to you is that research really needs to draw conclusions for policymakers. I read so often in journals really super fascinating research that will never make it into the hands of the people who make decisions. It wasn't actually created for that purpose. And sometimes we even ask those researchers to come and present at our meetings, and they'll say, no, we did the research, but we don't want to go so far as to say what you should do with it. That is a problem. So I would just really urge you to really think about who is the end user of this, who can benefit most, who is in the driver's seat, who's making decisions. It's important that you draw, to the extent that you can, conclusions for the decision makers. The other thing that we really find that works really well is to have the opportunity to do very deep dives with state legislators around issues. They need time outside of their state with their colleagues from other states to look very deeply at issues. We've had tremendous success with them around some of the most controversial issues in the past few years. A couple of examples come to mind, one being Common Core. Once they actually understood what it was and what the information was and what the purpose was and why Common Core even existed in the first place and who was in charge of adopting Common Core, they started to really get it, and then they were able to make better decisions about what was best for their state. Could we advance to the next slide? So one example that we've been referring to throughout this session of a project where we are taking legislators very deep is around international comparisons. State legislators, not this most recent PISA release, but 3 years ago, or actually 4 years ago now, were shocked and appalled by how the U.S. is doing on the PISA compared to other high-performing countries. And they wanted to know more about it. Was it a valid test? Should we really be paying attention to this? But even more importantly, they wanted to know, what are these other countries doing? What are the lessons that we can learn? They always want to know what other states are doing. So it just made sense to them that maybe there was something they can learn from these other high-performing countries. So over the past, I guess it's 3 years now, we've been working really closely with the National Center for Education and the Economy, Mark Tucker and Betsy Brown-Bruzy, and we have taken legislators on a small group of legislators on a very deep experience studying what these other countries do and what could be the implications here in the U.S. They learned the majority of what Mark was talking about, and this has moved them in big ways. I just wanted to give a few examples of what we're seeing as a result of this. A number of them are going back to their state saying, look, we've got to do something. We aren't happy with our education system. We know it's not working for us. Here's something that maybe we could think about doing a little bit differently, but it's not the silver bullets that we always think about. We have to do what Mark was talking about. We have to completely think about redesigning our system so that all the pieces work together to meet that end goal of where we want to be. We're seeing this happen in states like Indiana, Maryland, Colorado, and Delaware, just to name a few. We just had a meeting this weekend with a group of legislators where this group was talking to other legislators, and it was like the room just lit on fire. They were so excited because these legislators have had lots of time to dive into the research and really understand what they're talking about, and they're really starting to own it. I think a couple of places where you're also seeing this was in South Dakota, for example, where Representative Sly, who was a part of the study group, worked very hard in her state to put into place not just one silver bullet, but a package of different things that they could do to try to address the teacher shortage and the teacher attrition rate. We also, I just want to share this weekend, we had a legislator, a very, very conservative legislator, stand up and talk about, he said, I have a confession to make. I want to confess that this policy that we're talking about right now was something I fought against for the past 20 years because I was only thinking about myself and the world I knew. And it wasn't for me diving into the research and having experiences and understanding what things look like other places other than where I live and who my constituents are, I wouldn't be a supporter of this policy as I am now. I have completely made a 180 shift. And the whole room just erupted. And I had heard that earlier that week he was actually at his governor's commission on the teacher shortage, and he was talking about exactly what the study group had been learning. And a teacher from his state, one of the teachers of the year, called me and said, what have you been telling him? Like, all of a sudden he wants to raise teacher pay. He wants to do whatever he can to support teachers. He knows how important they are, but they're just one part of the entire system. So this works. This really works. So we're having so much success. So I just wanted to leave you with this very last slide. Our study group, this International Education Study Group, came up with a report. They recently released a report. It's called No Time to Lose, which was the previous slide. But this is the end of it. This is the message that they're sending to all of their colleagues. This came from them. They are saying we have no time to lose. We have to make changes. We have to own this. It can't just be us because we might be term limited or, politics sways with the wind. It has to be a large group of people working toward a common goal within our state, but we have to start now because there's no time to lose. So I just wanted to leave you with that quote. It's pretty powerful.
Thank you. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the examples that you gave was that it was a group of people spending a lot of time over a period of time with many sources of research, thinking deeply rather than just trying to respond in the moment. So it's a great and unusual example. Aaliyah, you're working with governors. You've worked at just about every level of the system, from the classroom to the to DC and the State House. And there are governors who are really taking some leadership right now on these issues. What are your thoughts about what most enables the kind of leadership that you are supporting with governors with respect to the research side of it?
Sure. So right now we're actually, this actually doesn't seem like it's on. Okay, good. So right now, actually, there is a lot of interest around governors. And in 2017, it's actually been termed the year of the governor in a lot of ways. And what we're seeing governors do, and this is outside of the Every Student Succeed Act, is they are really taking ownership and responsibility for what's happening within their state. Because of what's happening on the federal level, governors are taking a step back to say, this is my position, this is my space, and I do have a lot of opportunity. And so they are thinking innovatively, and they are willing to hear the research and at least have the discussion. I will say, one of the things, and I am an educator, I am not a policymaker. I got into education as a result of really starting to see the impact of policy on lives. And one thing we know is that policy changes people's lives, for the good or for the bad. And so that is my trajectory, and that's always my disclaimer. I am not a policymaker. I am an educator, just influencing policy, hopefully. And so it has been interesting within the last 18 months to really see the discourse change within the last year and a half, but then also thinking about the discourse in the next year and a half, really 2 years to come, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But one of the things that has been highlighted and really has crystallized in my mind more than anything is that words matter. Your messaging matters. And it's not that you have to change the research, it's not that you have to change the message, it's the words behind the message. Just yesterday, we had a 2-day meeting on the teacher-to-principal pipeline with 9 states in San Diego, and we're really helping these states think about how to create a comprehensive system so that teachers move into the leadership pipeline, or they at least stay in the field. And we had some very conservative states and then some that are kind of in the middle. And what was interesting in hearing the states have their own discussion is, what were the talking points they needed to then be able to move things in their governor's office? And there was a representative from the governor's office with each of the state teams. So they were all presented the same research, they had the same presenters, but during their state team time, they had to come back and say, okay, for X governor, what will really resonate? And that is what we need to think about, because at the end of the day, in order to move the work that we're thinking about, we have to think about the message. And so all the while it might not be your agenda, we have to understand the agenda, understand what resonates with that agenda, and then articulate the message in order to do so. The next year and a half are going to be critical in education, and really across all domains, but particularly in education, because education is the motherboard for all things. In 2017, there'll be 2 gubernatorial elections in New Jersey and also in Virginia. In 2018, we will have 36 gubernatorial elections. So we're talking about in a year and a half, we are going to have more than half of our governors change over. That's not the only change. We are going to have 79% of our legislative seats also turn over. 79% that begin this year. Then you couple that with redistricting that will also begin this year. Those are three major changes in the political landscape. And it doesn't end there. In 2020, we will have yet another presidential election. So when you look at all of those changing pieces in the political landscape, and you look at where we are within changes in education, what we do right now matters. So I want to just show you one other piece. So we have about 38 gubernatorial elections. We're going to have 79% of our legislative seats change. We're going to have redistricting occur. We're going to have a 2020 presidential election, and then a minimum of 18 new chiefs. So, and many of those state chiefs are appointed by governors. So we're talking about huge change on the state level for our education work. And so as we're talking about a very, very critical piece to the success of education in our children, and I am a parent, I have a kindergartner in a public school, I have another child who will be in public school within another 2-year period. What we do right now matters. So what I'd like for you to think about, I know I'm not supposed to give a charge, I don't know if that was what, okay, I can't, I got a green light, Linda gave me the green light, is to think about where you can begin gaining traction on this issue right now. And I'd like to give you some recommendations because we have a little bit of time to get ahead of the change rather than waiting for the change to be in the midst of it. One is to think about where your state is in the discussion around this issue and where your advocacy community is in the conversation. Also, to start engaging your parent communities because parents aren't as informed as we are. And with policy is like the black box on the plane that you don't really know why it survives a crash, but it does. That's also like policy. It's this thing that happens. A lot of folks in the community don't really understand all of the logistics behind it, but they need to start understanding because it could be huge implications. Also at the state level, we have time to control the narrative and control what those priorities are, particularly during this gubernatorial campaign season, to watch what the discussions are and what the priorities are. And so as you go back to your states, as you go back to your prospective positions, realize where the positions of power are within your state level and start thinking about that. Also, although there's going to be a lot of change on the higher state level, thinking about that level right underneath that generally don't turn over and start building those relationships there because they will be the ones that are going to be welcoming in that new level of leadership. And many times they've been there 10, 15, 20 years and they know that what the process of turnover is. And if you can get them on your side with the discussion, it can help move the cause forward. So just a couple of recommendations. From the National Governors Association side, we've recognized that this human capital piece is a huge part of the work. And so we are elevating it as a core issue and partnering with people like Linda to think about how do we think through the next 3 years and what pieces of the work can we elevate to governors at the right time so that as they come in and they're new and they're fresh and they're wanting information, we can provide them with the research, but with the right message so that it does resonate to them. So.
Wonderful. Thank you. So one of the things that Aaliyah pointed out, which I think of all the time, is that influencing policy is really about teaching. You think about that governor, you think about where they are as a learner, what their zone of proximal development might be, what their experience is, and then you start there and then you move from there. The same is true with legislators and with others who want to learn about how to approach these issues but are starting from a different experience basis. I want to give you a chance to raise questions that you may have. I have some more I'll bring up, but I want to see if people are sitting on any burning questions. Yes. Speak loudly.
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment related to Eula's comments. Her suggestion is, the suggestion which they do as a league, and they decide as a league to take it on, they are remarkably effective. They took on an issue of solar power in Florida and beat the public utility companies, even though the utility companies spent $100 million in advertising and the league only spent $100,000. And they beat them on the ballot for a constitutional amendment to have solar power in Florida. So I'm saying that when you go to look for allies in your fight for public education, the league is very, very interested in public education, and they welcome research and data because they don't make decisions unless they have good data from well-researched studies. So I strongly urge you to look for them as a partner in your alliances.
Terrific, thank you. Other,
In the back over there on that side.
yes, and then over there.
I was wondering if there was a governor you could point to and a U.S. senator who are leaders in doing good work on behalf of this issue.
Do you want to, I have my own nominee, but we'll ask Aaliyah first.
So from a governor's lens, there's actually quite a few that we've been working with that are really taking this issue head on. The one that comes to mind, and I just really like him just as a person too, is Governor Inslee out of Washington. He just has done so much, and not just in the K-12 space, but also thinking about early education as well. And I think that space gets left out. And until we start thinking about the whole continuum, we really are going to continue to have just a segregated school system. But Governor Inslee out of Washington, and he's doing just a lot around low-income children, racial equity, teacher shortage, just really looking at the educational system overall.
And I would just note that in Washington, that was going to be one of my nominees as well, they've taken a very comprehensive approach, much like what Mark began to outline and Michelle was elaborating on. They're not just proposing raises in teacher salaries, but doing it in an equalizing way, connecting it to the equalization of funding across districts in the state so that you reduce the inequities that are otherwise built into the system, connecting it to professional development for teachers and a career ladder which is built on the amount of learning engagement that teachers are involved in, and then at different junctures, performance assessments like the National Board portfolio for certification and something similar for beginning teachers and those who are receiving a high quality induction. So they're really thinking about it in a very holistic way, and I think that's sort of the point that you were making as well. And there are some other states that have done that, including states like South Dakota, which was mentioned earlier, with a Republican governor that had a task force with a very holistic approach as well. There was another thing that he wanted, though, besides the governor. Senator? Anybody want?
Senator, yeah.
Anybody want to nominate a senator? Well, I will nominate Patty Murray. And I'll also say that Lamar Alexander thinks hard about these issues as well, and they brought us the bipartisan Every Student Succeeds Act, which is a gigantic step forward from where we were. And both of them think about these issues of investing in teachers in somewhat different ways, but in some similar ways as well. Yes?
I'd like to hear a little bit.
I'm sorry, I meant to go to her next and then to you. Yeah.
For those of you at the Learning Policy Institute in particular, we know just as with teacher shortages in certain subjects and geographic areas, that there may also be surpluses in some of these certain subjects and different areas. In your research, did you look at any of that in the policy briefs that you have? Have you looked at any mechanisms to possibly incentivize or help teachers with multiple doors to address some of these areas?
Yeah, I'll start off and then others may want to join on. There are surpluses of teachers in states also that pay well. I mean, this is basically, largely economic. If you look at the rates of attrition in New England, they're so much smaller than the rates of attrition in the South. The salaries are higher. Many areas of surplus in states like Massachusetts, for example. And then there are areas of shortage in those states that are math, science, special ed. But the extent of shortage in the areas are very different across different places. So to the extent that the shortages are a function of poor salaries and awful working conditions, you can't solve them very much by just getting people to go in from other fields. But to the extent that they are because of opportunity costs in certain fields, you can incentivize entry into those fields. And some of the most successful strategies have been service scholarships, which basically say if you will teach in X field or Y field, or if you will re-credential in those fields or add a credential, we'll pay for your education, sometimes with a stipend and with other incentives associated with it. It's what we do in medicine when we have shortages of family practitioners or doctors who know how to treat AIDS or whatever. The government kind of pays their way, and then there's a service requirement attached to it. There's a lot of research about the effectiveness of those models. The other kind of model that's emerging, and we saw a bill in Texas and a bill in California to support residencies for teachers in urban and rural areas where basically candidates are sought in those high-need fields, including some who might have otherwise gone into a surplus area in math, science, special ed, bilingual education, et cetera. They get a free ride. They get placed in the classroom of an expert teacher, one of the best urban teachers, one of the best teachers in that high-need rural community, sometimes in a school that is organized to support their work, while they get a credential program from a university that partners and provides all of the classes. They apprentice. They get a very supportive and applied credentialing program, end up with a master's degree after a year, and then they pledge 3 to 5 years of service in that community. And there you're solving many of the pieces of the shortage problem at the same time, including many of the pieces of the inequity problem at the same time. So there are some of those kinds of things as well. I think in special education, the shortages in the United States, in many, many states, are like a 5-alarm fire. And the need for people both who already have certain credentials to add on to them with a specialist credential. And we should say, if you will do that, we will completely pay for your education, and maybe some places are even adding stipends or bonuses in the salary schedule for using the credential, because a lot of teachers with that credential don't use it because it's challenging work and harder work. And so a combination of those things can be put to use. Does anybody else want to talk about the... Okay. Yes.
And I think you addressed it a bit. I was just curious as far as the rural school districts and all that. Sometimes they have unique problems that they have there, and often is it true across the nation that a lot of the rural school districts have shortages there as well?
Yeah.
Is that also true for other countries that, like Australia, that has a rural, so that they have more of a shortage in the rural areas?
We have the dean from the University of Melbourne with us. Field, would you like to answer that question about Australia?
Well, it's a similar problem. Australia isn't quite the size of the US, but it's not far off it, so we do have remote communities, and it's a similar problem. We have one-teacher schools at one extreme, and it's typically some of these kids don't complete school with high levels, and then they go into teaching, and so we've got this cycle of inequity, if you like, and difference. So we also show up on the OECD scale with a above average spread between our most able and our least able. And what's troubling in Australia is our least able. Australia's been tracking backwards now for the last 5 PISA, so that's 12 years worth. It's the top 30% that are doing most of the tracking backwards, and that worries us as well. So, and a lot of resources have gone into looking at the bottom 25% without a lot of shift. So it's stepping back, and this has been a fantastic session, because the next phase after being dean is about trying to work on policy and so on, and getting a global feel from what you're talking about here is. I will be coming to you later, Lyndon, and say, can I come and spend a few days
Does anybody else want to speak to the rural teacher? There are, incentives in Australia to get people to go, teach in rural areas and to do their clinical practice and their student teaching, and greater scholarships available and that kind of thing. Mark.
Yeah, I might just draw a contrast between the most popular way, what shall I say, the most popular advice given to state legislatures on school finance formulas here in the United States and what we've seen in some other countries. In the Scandinavian countries, the amount of resources that a school gets is a function of what it takes to deliver the official state curriculum. And so if you are north of the Arctic Circle and you're in a very small school and you only have 3 students and you are required to teach physics, you get a lot of money. In the United States, typically, the way the school finance formulas work, increasingly, they are based on the idea that the amount of money that a district gets, among other things, ought to be pegged to the cost of living there. It produces exactly the opposite result in the United States. It makes it very hard to attract teachers who could work in urban areas to rural ones because they will be paid less, as a matter of policy, because that's what it does. So we could learn something from other countries with respect to the way they think about equalizing between rural areas and urban ones.
Just checking to see if any of the other folks want to add anything on this. Richard, was that a yes, or was that a, what was that?
Well, I was up in Alaska, and they have a similar problem where just really difficult to get. There's a great deal of sort of isolated rural areas, and everyone wants to live in Fairbanks and Juneau, and so they have to come up with various types of incentives to get people to go and stay and teach in small communities. It's a big state.
In places like Singapore and some other countries that we've looked at, teachers are assigned by the Ministry of Education. So they're assigned to go where the needs are, rather than sort of everybody out there searching in a group for who's going to teach where. It's a very interesting and unorganized process in the United States. But in order to get promoted, and they have quite a long career ladder for leaders in teaching and leaders in leadership and in specialist roles, you really have to go to the highest need schools and demonstrate your skill and expertise and capacity and commitment in order to move up the ladder. So it's another kind of incentive system. Yes. Yeah. Before Aaliyah answers this, I just want to note that in the 5 countries we studied in empowered educators, high-performing countries with well-developed teaching systems, all highly unionized, but the governments in some cases are so alert to raising salaries that the unions don't even have to bargain for salaries. They can then work on all kinds of other professional issues. So it is a big difference.
This discussion about unions came up yesterday with our states, and the states that had more local control from a funding perspective, from just all aspects, they cannot ignore the union discussion far more than other states that may not. And so, for example, in Utah, they want to survey their teachers to get some additional information to help improve, hopefully, compensation, look at some of the credentialing processes that they have in place, and they're not going to be able to do that without including the unions, because there's no part of their system that's centralized. And so I think it really is a state-by-state discussion. And then there are some states where the unions are seen as a credible partner. And then there's other states where the unions kind of help the prisoners run the prison, you know. So I think it depends on the state, it depends on the relationship, and then also who really has the education control as well.
I just want to add, you know, the big elephant in the room that drives a lot of these market-based policies that, you know, tend to work against education in spite of the research, and that's pushed by, you know, groups like ALEC, right? They have an agenda. You know, part of this is to vilify teachers' unions, to vilify public education itself, so much to the extent that some members who, you know, receive dollars, you know, and a lot of hard lobbying from them are going to vote against their interests. And I'm not saying that just because, you know, I'm from Texas. I think our teacher associations have been very vigilant because they're not unions, right? They're only associations. But I think they've been very vigilant over the years. But there's been, you know, little chopping away at that, you know, and sometimes it comes full frontal, you know, through voucher policies, for example, through expansion of charter schools that that don't have to have, you know, necessarily certified teachers, et cetera, through the proliferation of, and this isn't necessarily ALEC-based, but it's similar, the proliferation of temporary faculty agency, TFAs, right? So, you know, and this isn't about, you know, trying to make education better for all students. These are very politically oriented strategies to defeat public education and to put more public money in private pockets. And so how do you do that? You push back against teacher unions who often try and fight for, you know, better pay and better living conditions, and, you know, you follow it up with all these other different strategies.
Okay, on that point, we have, yeah, go ahead, Johnny.
You know, as you continue with respect to talking about Texas and the direction the legislature is going now, particularly in relation to the most recent litigation, that the court said one thing, but the legislation doesn't appear to be paying much attention.
Can you tell us what legislation that is before you start answering? Or the litigation?
Well, the litigation is the latest Texas school finance case, I guess, the Texas Taxpayer Student and Fairness Coalition versus Williams. I was the lead attorney when I was at MALDEF for the Edgewood Independent School District Group. And so basically the court came back, despite a mountain of evidence, you know, in the trial record, similar to what happened to us in Colorado, except there they kind of, well, yeah, it was very similar to what happened. You know, we build this mountain of evidence, have these, 463 single-spaced pages of findings of fact. Thankfully, we have computers. But, you know, that were a stinging indictment of the Texas public educational system, you know, partly on educational opportunities, largely on, you know, its school finance policy. And at the end of the day, the court came back and said, well, you know what, we don't know too much about whether or not how much money matters. You know, there was the Coleman report that, you know, is very
1966.
deficit oriented. Yeah. And I wasn't even born then. I can actually say that there. You know, they were just pulling this stuff out. It reads like a horrible educational policy brief, but it's a legal opinion. So now you have, you know, the Texas Senate, which is much more conservative here in Texas, and they're like, well, we don't need to do anything about education. We'll fund, you know, enrollment growth, which we grow by 80,000 students each year here in Texas. But the House side is trying to do some things that will put in about 1.8 billion, and I think it's been, you know, some of those smart messages that we've had, you know, to legislators, been our own analysis that we've provided on the equity gaps and the inadequacy. They're only given 100 million to bilingual education, but it'll be the first increase in the weight if it does go through. The Senate says no way, especially because they can't get vouchers here in Texas. So anyways, I think, you know, those dynamics are really hitting the head right now. And matter of fact, I keep on checking my phone because they have a special ed voucher bill on the House side now that we're testifying on, the research on. So anyways.
So I'm curious. Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
I just wanted to mention, I think this actually gets at both of your questions. There's no doubt about the fact that there is some significant pressure on policymakers right now. We, at a meeting that we just had this weekend, we had our school finance expert present the outlook of the budgets in the states right now, generally, and what the education budget looks like, and it's not good in the majority of states. Even though the economy is starting to turn around, states are not gaining revenue. In some states, you have constitutional amendments like my home state in Colorado that doesn't allow, even if we have excess revenue, to spend it. In other states, they rely heavily on energy and so forth. They're really in trouble. So we've got states in a crisis situation. We also have a situation right now where states are working really hard to figure out what their ESSA implementation plans are going to be. So we hosted a session called A Perfect Storm ? Right at the very time when the chief state school officers have a mandate to be engaging with stakeholders, that includes governors and legislators, around their ESSA state plan, they also are facing major crisis within their state. And it's pushing big, deep conversations in states like, frankly, we've never seen before. We see a lot of tinkering around the edges a lot, but we have a lot of legislators coming to us going, we've got to do something. Things are bad. Our education system isn't good. Our budget's a mess. We've got to think deeply. We're hearing from stakeholders because we have to be hearing from stakeholders right now, including the unions. We have to we're being forced to talk to them, and we're getting a lot of feedback, and we know that everybody's not happy. So I think you're going to see some pretty significant, deep conversations going on in a number of states. And it's really important that those conversations be informed by facts. I just heard the other day on the radio, and this scared the bejeebers out of me, that sociologists are saying we're moving past a fact-based organization. What does that mean for all of you who do research? That's scary.
Yeah.
And so as long as we try to do our best to inform all those deep conversations that are going on and bring in the important voices, people who are the most conservative need to be at the table with the people who are the most liberal, and everybody in between, to have these deep conversations about a vision for where their states need to go. But I think the time is actually ripe. I think the time for states to tinker around the edges is kind of over.
Well, it is 5:35, and that's actually a very good statement on which to end, and I'm going to invite you to come up and talk to us about your question afterwards. It is a moment where almost every state is deeply digging in between the influence of ESSA and all of these other forces that people have. There is a lot of use of ideas, facts, and alternative facts, evidence of all kinds, commissions, task forces, working groups in almost every state, and a time where there is quite a lot of demand, actually, for evidence and research at the table. So go ye forth and contribute, and thank you. Give us a round of applause for this wonderful panel.